All right, so today we are going to be looking at the second step in information processing, dealing with storage. So when we first talked about this computer analogy, we used encoding, clickety click click click, to enter the information or the mouse into the computer. The second thing we talked about was storage, the process by which information is maintained over a period of time. And that happens in the computer's hard drive right here. And we know that in terms of retaining information, it can be short-lived or it can be very, very long. It can be something that lasts a lifetime or somewhere in between. But a lot of that depends on how much effort was put into encoding. So we're going to take a look at the 3 stages of memory. First off, with sensory memory. Sensory memory is something that typically we find students don't know a whole lot about. They've heard of short-term memory, they've heard of long-term memory, but they didn't realize that we also have what's called sensory memory. And this is something that involves bottom-up processing, taking all of that information in through our senses. Everything goes through sensory memory. What we find is that sensory memory is a very brief memory storage that immediately follows the initial reception of a stimulus. So everything we see, smell, taste, touch, hear, and feel enters our sensory memory. What it does is it allows for our senses to hold on to the memory for a fraction of a second. There are 2 kinds of sensory memory. There's iconic, which is visual. It's visual sensory memory that lasts for 1 to 2 seconds. A good example that I think of with iconic sensory memory is when you look on or look in the phone book to find a number and you read the numbers, and from the time you look at it in the phone book to entering it in the phone, sometimes you have to look again because you've already forgotten what those numbers are. That's iconic memory. So you look at something and within 1 or 2 seconds, it's gone. It's very short-lived. Echoic memory is another type of very short-lived sensory memory. This lasts a little bit longer than the visual iconic sensory memory, but still not very long, 3 or 4 seconds. An excellent example of echoic sensory memory is introductions. You might reach out your hand, shake someone's hand, they'll tell you their name, and within 3 or 4 seconds, you think to yourself, oh my gosh, I've already forgotten their name. So that's something a lot of us can relate to. So our sensory memory is very brief and very short-lived. This slide shows us the importance, however, of sensory memory. We have sensory memory because it allows for us to filter out information that's unnecessary. It prevents us from being overwhelmed. I mean, think if you did have to remember everything that you took in via your sensory storage. It gives our brain a chance to decide, is this worth paying attention to, or should I pay attention to it? You know, we've talked about selective attention and how a lot of things, if we don't specifically pay attention to it, go unnoticed. And that's part of our sensory memory. So sensory memory is a very important thing that helps us to not be overwhelmed by all the sensory stimulus we are bombarded with. It gives our memory a chance to decide whether or not it's something important that we need to pay attention to and process. But it also provides us with a very continuous and stable experience. Sensory memory allows for us to have a very fluid, continuous experience that's not chopped up and not fragmented. The next stage of memory is our short-term memory, sometimes referred to as STM. Our short-term memory is limited in its capacity to about 7 items, according to George Miller. He's on our vocab sheet, and he's the one who came up with this kind of magic rule of 7. And it's also limited by our active rehearsal and how much effort we put into rehearsing the information. It needs to be repeated in order for us to put it into short-term memory. And this is when we talk about effortful processing and how when we encode information, if we truly want it to stay for longer than, a minute, we need to somehow either give it meaning, we need to rehearse it, we need to come up with a mnemonic device, some kind of visual imagery, and then it can stay in our short-term memory longer. Maintenance rehearsal is a type of rehearsal of encoding where we repeat the information without an attempt to find meaning in it. And it is pretty short-lived. The example I gave you with iconic sensory memory, if we wanted our phone number that we looked up in the phone book to be there long enough for us to encode it and dial it into the phone book, we would have to repeat it out loud. 651, 252, 2810. We repeat it, we maybe acoustically encode it so that we can dial it in the phone. But even after about 12 seconds, according to maintenance rehearsal, we probably would not be able to repeat that number because we're really not saying it out loud to retain that information longer than we need it, which is just to dial it into the phone. Some other examples of long or short-term memory involve chunking. And we talked about chunking with the encoding piece and how Gestalt principles allow for us to naturally group things together, making them easier. And so we look at automatically grouping in order for us to remember, like phone numbers, social security numbers, those kinds of things. We typically remember about 7 chunks of information. And guess how long phone numbers are? 651, 252, 2301. They are about 10 numbers long. If you just have the prefix with the last 4 digits, then you have about 7. So grouping them, making it easier to remember and retain the information. Look at this first example here. If I had you read through all these letters in a row and try with 100% accuracy, recall all of the letters, you might have a difficult time. However, if I were to chunk them, you can see that besides the letter F, they're all television networks. That's why I mentioned social security numbers, phone numbers. They're good examples of how chunking works. Working memory. Now, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is a newer understanding of short-term memory. And what it does is it allows for us to take what we are at the moment consciously actively processing, any visual, spatial, or auditory information, and process it and use it. Like if I were to say, all right, I want you guys to think about what we've learned so far in the memory unit, and I'd like you to write down 3 or 4 terms that come to mind. That is, using your working memory. And then if I asked you to retrieve information from your long-term memory so that you're presently using some information, I might say, all right, I want you guys to list for me all of the teachers that you can remember that were your teachers in elementary school from kindergarten through 6th grade. That would be information that you're retrieving from your long-term memory that you are now actively displaying that you possess that knowledge. So it's a combination of memories that are currently in your brain as well as ones that you can retrieve from long-term memory. The last stage in memory is called long-term memory, or LTM. And this is where information is stored for long periods of time, sometimes forever. There is some information that you might have stored in your long-term memory that isn't there up until the day you die, but for the most part, our long-term memory is unlimited in its capacity and it lasts for a long, long time, if not a lifetime. So this visual is nice because it shows you sensory memory. Here we have our sensory input, how everything comes into sensory memory, everything via our senses, and a lot of the unattended information quickly goes away, whether it's iconic, 1 to 2 seconds, or echoic, 3 or 4 seconds long. That which we have paid attention to goes into our short-term memory or our working memory, that maintenance rehearsal where we're actively, consciously rehearsing the information. If we are not rehearsing it semantically or giving it meaning, we may find that that unrehearsed information is quickly lost within 20 seconds. Some of our working memory includes retrieving long-term memories, which I just talked about. And then sometimes our sensory memory goes right to long-term memory. Maybe it's one of those flashbulb memories that we talked about at the beginning of the chapter that was tied to emotion that you know is going to be with you for the rest of your life. Some of your long-term memories, however, do decay, and maybe your memory of kindergarten was more detailed when you were in elementary school. Over middle school, some of those details of your kindergarten classroom faded, and maybe by the time you get into your 50s, you may recall less and less about your kindergarten days. That would be an example of how sometimes your long-term memories do fade over time. When we talk about storing memories in the brain, there's a section in our book called long-term potentiation. And this is an increase in the synapse firing potential after brief rapid stimulation, and it's believed to be this neural basis for learning memory. What we find with long-term potentiation is that neurons that fire together wire together, and that's why practice literally makes perfect. We have these neural networks that form the more and more we rehearse information. We also are linking in long-term memories what we talked about with flashbulb memories and how stress hormones in the brain stress hormones alert the brain to important events. That's why the amygdala is that area of your brain that processes emotion, and it triggers hormonal changes that produce lasting memories. There are a couple different types of long-term memory storage. One of them is called explicit memory. Explicit memories are facts and experiences that we can consciously know and declare. When I ask you to list your elementary school teachers, you are explicitly recalling something from your past that you know and can declare. Yep, I remember that Mrs. Foster was my kindergarten teacher. Miss Johnson was my first grade teacher. Mrs. Duvet was my second grade teacher. Mrs. Fryer was my third grade teacher, Mrs. Byrne my fourth, Mrs. Sailing my fifth, and Mr. Olson my sixth. See, even at almost 40 years of age, I can explicitly recall all of my elementary school teachers. This type of long-term memory is processed in my hippocampus. Another type of long-term memory is called implicit memory. Implicit memories are learned skills that we don't consciously recall encoding. And so they're automatically processed when we talked about automatic versus effortful processing. And these can be skills and habits, classically conditioned fears or behaviors. We all know, let me use, for example, riding a bike. If you don't actually have an explicit memory of recalling your bike riding experiences, but to this day you can get on a bike and you can ride around, that would be an example of an implicit memory. You can demonstrate that you have these skills, but you don't remember actually learning how to ride a bike. There's so many examples that you could give, whether it's, writing your name. You know how to write your name, but many of us don't have any memory of actually learning how to hold a pencil and to write our name down. But we can show and demonstrate we possess that knowledge. The implicit memories in long-term memory are processed in the cerebellum. So you do need to remember the hippocampus for explicit memories and the cerebellum for implicit memories. Here's a nice visual to end with. Long-term memories, explicit, these are declarative memories with conscious recall, processed in our hippocampus. They're general knowledge and facts. They're personally experienced events that we can know and recall. Implicit, more procedural type of memory without conscious recall, processed in part by the cerebellum, kind of our skills and motor cognitive abilities, and our classical and operant conditioning behaviors. And that's it for storage.